just in time for the live Bulwark Sunday. We had a couple of technical problems, and I was about ready to summarize everything Eric has to say, but instead he can say it in his own words. Eric, thank you for surviving the technical problems and for joining me today on this eventful day. Eric, of course, you all know, former Undersecretary of Defense, a distinguished Foreign Service career, ambassador to two nations, served in the White House, and has written many times for the Bulwark. And he and our friend Elliot Cohen co-host Shield of the Republic, excellent show, which I'm hopefully you did an excellent one late last week before the U.S. strike, and you hopefully will do another one early this week to give us a longer and more scholarly version of what we're going to talk about today. But I thought today really be helpful. I mean, you and I have talked on the phone many times in the last 36, 48 hours, but really give people just a sense of what to look for, what's most striking. So always the headlines, people have to, obviously all these things will have to be developed so much more in the weeks and months to come. But anyway, Eric, thanks for joining me today.
Always good to be with you, Bill. So look, this is a amazing.
Yeah, what happened? Let's do this. What is it a big deal? You were in government 40 years. You saw a lot of big events and momentous ones. This is pretty big.
Yeah, as former President Biden might have said, it's a big effing deal. Look, this was an amazing demonstration of the American military's global reach and its ability to synchronize military activities across a variety of domains, air, sea, space, cyber, electronic warfare. I mean, it was really a pretty impressive display. It was the first operational use of the GBU-57, a 15,000-pound bomb known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator that we actually began developing late in the Bush 43 administration for precisely this purpose, to go after deep and buried targets that were difficult to get to from other conventional munitions. And obviously, if you don't want to use a nuclear weapon, which is, I don't think, ever advisable if you can avoid it, it was exactly created for this purpose. I think there's some ancillary, benefits here to this. One is that I think it shows that the president's willing to use military power to defend American interests. That's got to be something that President Putin, President Xi take into account. Kim Jong-un, as said, it shows the reach of our military and the effectiveness of our military tools. But by the way, we shouldn't be resting on our laurels. We got plenty to do in terms of funding the military. And I would add that I think the current big, beautiful bill, which has $150 billion plus up for the military, is totally unsatisfactory in terms of how it funds the military. But, this clearly did some damage to the Iranian nuclear facilities. How much, we still don't know. We'll have to wait for the bomb damage assessment to come, but first blush looks like it certainly did some pretty significant damage. Whether it obliterated them, as the president said in his speech last night, I think that's a different story. We'll have to wait on.
I mean, with all the obvious caveats, we're one day in, and it's one event, and things could reverse wildly and go in unanticipated directions. And I was in government with you in 1991 at the beginning of the first Gulf War, which actually went very well, but at the end of the day, we left Saddam in power and maybe laid the foundation for future troubles in the Middle East, unfortunately. And anyway, it didn't help President Bush politically. I'm thinking about how many of these things bounce. And so people say, Trump's, going to be reelected. Trump, there was majority opposition to attacking Iran. People need to understand, but people might wish to understand how dynamic war situations are, and both in the war itself, I think, but also in the politics of it, at home and internationally. I mean, you've already mentioned Xi and Putin. Most of the analysis is pretending they don't exist. But I mean, Iran is a pretty good buddy of both of them. Iran, we know, the Iranian drones being used by Russia. And somehow, so far, with all those caveats, that doesn't seem to be the axis of evil. What are we calling it these days? The axis of
upheaval.
Axis of the bad axis. The bad axis.
Axis of autocrats.
a bad day for the bad axis, right? I think in that respect. And for the U.S. military, Woodward, you served in the Defense Department. Some of us have been so worried, and I remain very worried, about Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, about the politicization of the military, about a lot of things that happened. You were a very strong critic of the firing of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who you knew and know, and who was very well regarded. Political firing is not a good idea. Having said that, it seems to me as a layman that, I don't know, the U.S. military did a pretty good job here, and the Defense Department did a pretty good job of at least keeping things quiet and so forth, right?
Well, two things. One, to the prior point about the, whatever access you want to call it, this is a demonstration that, President Putin, is not all that anxious to, come to the defense of some of his putative allies. And when Putin was asked about all this, it was before the U.S. strike, of course, but he said, well, Israel is, practically a Russian country. There are 2 million, Russian citizens living in Israel. So, I can't, join in a fight against them. So, that's, one thing. On the Pentagon, look, I think all the concerns about Secretary Hegseth remain. That nothing changed, nothing that's happened here has changed my view of any of that. I would say, however, that, this was a demonstration of the professionalism of the U.S. military and their enormous skill. And I would say in the press conference this morning that General Kane, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, acquitted himself extremely well. He did an extraordinary job, I thought, of walking through, all the details of the operation, the timeline, the number of aircraft, some of the deception that was involved in order to maintain tactical surprise. And it did, I thought, a very commendable and open job. And oh, by the way, said what you and I said just a few minutes ago, which is we think we did some damage, but until we really get the bomb damage assessment over the next several days, we're going to have to wait and see. And now what's going to happen is, I will say one thing about bomb damage assessment, and I'm only sorry that our colleague Adam Kinzinger couldn't join us today because he might have a different view. But my view is that, from being inside government, pilots, almost always believe after a bombing mission that they have hit the target and destroyed it. It's just it's just natural that they react that way. But you really do need to take a look, in the aftermath and see exactly what has been accomplished. And you can see from some of the overhead satellite photography that's already available that the GBU-57s made some very pinpoint entry points into the facility at Fordow, which is the major issue that was, before us. But you still don't know exactly how much damage was done down below. I suspect considerable, but we don't know. And so now the effort will be to collect all sorts of different kinds of intelligence, MASINT, measurement and signature intelligence, communications intelligence, signals intelligence, perhaps some human intelligence that the Israelis have that will be shared with us as a partner. And all of that has to be put together to get, a real sense of how much damage was done. I would add that the work that was done on the Isfahan plant is also very important. It's not only a plant where the yellow cake is turned into UF6 gas for injection into the centrifuges to enrich uranium. It's also the place where uranium metal was recovered by the Iranians, which would have to be used in fashioning an actual warhead. And so, essentially, I think some good work was done yesterday. And now we'll have to see, as you said, how will the Iranians react? What are their options? And, what comes next? And whenever you undertake military action, there are all sorts of unforeseen potential consequences. There are all sorts of dangers, but there are also, of course, dangers of inaction. And I think a lot of times we tend to only focus on what are the dangers of action and not on the dangers of inaction. And that's a problem For instance, that our former colleague in government, Dennis Ross, describes in his new book on statecraft in a very interesting chapter on the Obama administration in which he served, that the Obama administration, overlearning some of the lessons of the Iraq War, perhaps, failed to understand the significant consequences of inaction in Syria, which turned out to be very serious. I mean, not just because it, unleashed a horrible civil war, which allowed the Russians and the Iranians to intervene, but also because it set off a wave of refugees throughout the region that destabilized European politics, helped give rise to populist nationalist movements all around Europe. So,
right. So it's the inaction is a choice too. Once you're a global superpower, obviously other countries don't have to make these choices in a way. But I think for me, I wanted to ask you about the last 9 days and Israel's action. There's so many things to talk about, but for me, one thing that's striking, is the degree to which Trump wanted to avoid foreign wars. He sort of wanted to avoid foreign entanglements. At least some of his supporters did. That was kind of the theory of America first. For me, and I wrote this, I think, on Thursday or Friday in a very short way, so I was a little under the weather in Morning Shots, but I think America First is kind of finished in the sense that, maybe overstating it, but the notion that we just stay out of things seems a little hard to sustain now. People can like or dislike this military strike. They can say he should have had given diplomacy more of a chance. Very few people are saying Trump should have just ignored what was happening between Israel and Iran. And so when you think about it, that is the theory of America First. The theory of America First is two countries fighting 10,000 miles or however many miles away, neither in a way that doesn't directly threaten our homeland. It doesn't threaten even that much, honestly. We could deter them probably from threatening our interests too much, right? Of course, from America First point of view, why do we have those interests all over the Middle East anyway? So I feel like it opens the door to a more serious debate, maybe, about what America's role in the world should be, as opposed to sort of whether we need to have a role in the world. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll see where the debate goes. We'll see what all of Trump's supporters do. But for now, Trump is the guy who, here's what I want to ask you also, who, following on Israeli action, which he may not have entirely wanted, he was seen 2 weeks ago. I think we might have bet that he was going to go with that Witkoff peace plan and give Iran sort of a way, a path that I think we would have thought was not a good one in terms of not really curbing their nuclear program enough, sort of an updated Obama JCPOA. We all wrote and talked about that, right? It's funny. This is how events, right? One event, Netanyahu's action, with or without Trump's collusion or green light or yellow light, then the way the war went with Israel's amazing success, then Fordow becoming this kind of big thing question, would we finish the job as much as one can with one wave of strikes, and then Trump pulling the trigger on that really does, it's a 2 week, the world can change in 2 weeks due to no one person exactly planning to change it, but a series of events. But again, the U.S. being so hard for us to get out of our system, for better or worse, I would say for better, the notion that if there's a big conflict in the world, we sort of need to be thinking about what we should do. We might decide on inaction, as you said, but we are not going to walk away.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the president last week, and I'm losing track of the days because there's
just so people know, we're speaking midday on Sunday right. The 22nd. So.
But a couple of days ago, when some of the splits inside MAGA started to manifest themselves with Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and others coming out raising questions about whether the president should do this before he actually struck, the president said, I'm the one who invented America First. No one ever used that term before, and I get to decide what it means. Well, I mean, the reality, of course, is that America First was a very powerful movement in the 1930s against U.S. intervention in the war in Europe. But America First had a sizable contingent of folks who even, in the 30s were not opposed to the war in the Pacific. They were, Asia first, and and there's an element of that in Trumpism today, as well. But as you say, even that, of course, implies some U.S. involvement, in the Indo-Pacific. And the reality, inescapable reality, I think, which we pointed to in the National Defense Strategy Commission that I co-chaired with former Representative Jane Harman, and which reported out last summer, we made the point that all of these theaters, Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, are linked to one another because of the intensifying cooperation and relationship among Russia, Iran, the PRC, and North Korea. Now, some of that may be fraying a little bit because of these decisions that both Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump have made, and that might be all to the good. But again, we'll have to see how it all plays out. There've been all sorts of aircraft landing in Iran from the PRC. We don't know what's in those aircraft, whether it's ballistic missile components or what have you, to allow them to reconstitute some of their ballistic missile production. A lot can happen from here on in. But I think, as you say, it's extremely hard to see how the United States stays out of it. And by the way, we're talking about a regime. A lot of people say, well, this is between Israel and Iran. This is a regime whose founding ethos was death to America and death to Israel. And on its ballistic missiles, they have painted a Iranian revolutionary slogan, which is "America can't do a damn thing about this." Well, President Trump yesterday actually proved that wasn't right. Yeah,
that's nice. One other thing, I want to talk about the present, really the future for a few minutes, but you're a historian, and the reverse, you and I have talked often about the irony of history, the cunning of reason, whatever those phrases of Hegel and so forth are. Things just go in funny directions. And I mean, if you had told us after October 7th, 2023, so that's less than 2 years ago, a little over a year and a half ago, after the worst defeat, the worst slaughter of Israelis, of Jews actually, since in half a century, the worst failure of Israeli intelligence, an Israeli government it was already unpopular and now has suffered this failure, then a kind of grueling and pretty brutal war in Gaza that wasn't necessarily going very well. I mean, Israel was doing a lot of damage to Hamas, but from their point of view, not much, a lot of criticism from around the world, including the U.S. And then if you had said, okay, Israel has this Hezbollah plan that they've been working on for years, and they're going to be able to execute that pretty amazingly, and suddenly this huge deterrent that Hezbollah is supposed to provide for Iran right there on the border doesn't happen. Then out of nowhere revolution in Syria in December, I guess it was, of last year, and that's another Iranian proxy and safe harbor to some degree, goes away. And then Netanyahu decides he can do what he did over the last 8 days. Trump decides to ignore Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and a lot of others and support him. I don't know. It's a real, the degree to which those events were not predictable, I don't think. Maybe some genius saw that coming, but in October of 2023, it's a good lesson, that these things do not go in one direction, right? And that individual decisions make a huge difference. And some of them are not even decisions, just events, maybe slightly flukish events. I don't know. Some of them planned events. The destruction of Hezbollah is pretty impressive, but some of them maybe slightly flukish, like the Syrian civil war. I don't know.
Well, it's again, I think, a reminder that, so much of this is interconnected, but it's not always easy to see ahead of time how things are connected. So, yes, I mean, I think, Hamas clearly was a element of Iran's strategy of surrounding Israel with a ring of fire of proxies who could, and their plan was essentially to use those proxies ultimately, and then their own forces to destroy Israel. But what's happened, I mean, if you want to talk about Hegel's cunning of reason, what happened is the Israelis, there's a lot of criticism, I agree, that one might have about the Gaza campaign, particularly in the more recent weeks and months. But having said that, Hamas has been destroyed as a organized military force. The Israelis then, who always were more concerned, I mean, part of the reason they were surprised on October 7th was they were much more focused on the north rather than the south. They mistakenly thought that they had a modus vivendi with Hamas. That turned out to be a serious misjudgment, but they then turned to their longstanding plans to deal with Hezbollah, and as you say, kind of eviscerated Hezbollah. They then essentially destroyed in October, after Iran, for the second time, launched a major ballistic missile and cruise missile and drone attack against Israel. They destroyed Iran's advanced integrated air and missile defense. Not all of the air defense, by the way, but basically the Russian S-400 systems that had been provided to Iran. Because Russia was preoccupied elsewhere in Ukraine, it had already withdrawn a lot of its equipment from Syria, and now that the Iranians were also, engaged in essentially a long distance, quasi war with Israel, they were not paying as much attention to Syria either. So in a sense, it wasn't complete. I mean, it struck all of us as out of the blue for Assad to fall, but it wasn't really out of the blue. It was connected to
Good point.
to all of this, and all of it in sum created a moment of opportunity that Bibi Netanyahu decided he couldn't pass up and had to take, combined with the fact that, and I think this is important because there's a lot of discussion about how there is no intelligence. Tucker Carlson said that Iran was planning to make a bomb. In fact, there is, and I would refer people to The Economist, which had a very good look indirectly at the new intelligence based on briefings the Israelis have provided to allied intelligence services about an effort that clearly appears to have been underway to create a group inside the SPND, the nuclear program for Iran, to have a capability to race to a bomb, and it included secreting away some of the 60% highly enriched uranium from the IAEA in order to be the feed stock for that weapon. So there is some intelligence. How complete it is, I suspect it's fragmentary, but it was enough, I think, to convince Netanyahu that there was no point in waiting around for this. And I think that's fair. As the IAEA reported, at the end of last month, when it reported to the Board of Governors, Iran had over 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium at 60%, which is essentially a step from bomb grade. And there's no other country in the world that has amassed that much highly enriched uranium that is not a nuclear weapons power. And when you add that to the fact that Iran had this arsenal of 2,000 ballistic missiles, there's no country in the world with 2,000 ballistic missiles that's not a nuclear power. And so, hard not to feel compelled to connect the dots.
No, that's very interesting. And so I was even trying to remember why. I think in retrospect, people will say that there's Iranian barrages against Israel. I guess there were two, right? That we all focused at the time, or I did at least, that the Biden administration had helped Israel stop them, and that was good, and not good depending on your point of view, good from my point of view. And they didn't succeed much. They didn't do that much damage in Israel and so forth. But I suppose, the provocation for that was that Israel had attacked Iranian personnel or assets, if I'm not mistaken, in Lebanon, right? Israel had not attacked Iran first, so to speak, at that point, I think. The attack was on Iranians, not on Iran. And Iran took that as inappropriate to blow up, as I recall, some Iranian senior officials who were working with with Hezbollah and attacked Israel. But I suppose that opened up what they learned from that attack and from stopping that attack. Maybe was quite important, actually, in giving them confidence that they could go ahead and do what they did in this past week, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, so the Israelis had attacked IRGC personnel both in Lebanon and in Syria, part of Iran's proxy network, and Iran did use that as the occasion for firing, barrage, the largest ballistic missile attacks on another country in history. We shouldn't, neglect that. I think the Israelis did learn some things from that. They certainly learned some things from their retaliation in October.
Yeah, I guess that was the key, right? Yeah, but they wouldn't have had opportunity or excuse, if you want to be more, Machiavellian about it, to retaliate without the Iranians deciding they had to show strength and attack Israel, right? So
the retaliation in April at the instance of the Biden administration was fairly limited, and basically just a calling card. Took out a radar around Natanz and basically said, we can hit you, so don't do this again. The second time, they went out and they essentially used their F-35s which have a stealth capability, to go in and take out all of these high-end Russian-supplied air and missile defense radars. So they cleared essentially a path for them to be able to do what they did 10 days ago, which was start this campaign to degrade and destroy Iran's capability, not just on the nuclear side, but also on the ballistic missile side. And they did it by going after the command and control of the Iranian forces. And they've also, and I think this is has not been acknowledged enough. You hear people say that you can't destroy the knowledge of nuclear weapons, even if you destroy the program. And of course, that's true, at some level, which is that the physics of this are well known. It's not a secret, really, how to build a nuclear weapon. That said, it requires some real engineering skill. And Israel has not only sort of eviscerated the senior leadership of the IRGC and the Artesh, the regular Iranian military, but also the scientific leadership of the nuclear program. They have already been conducting a campaign for years of killing Iranian nuclear scientists. In 2020, it's believed that Mossad was behind the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was sort of the Oppenheimer of the Iranian nuclear program. But they've also, they stole his archive. The Israelis exfiltrated that in 2018. And in one of the strikes, I believe actually before this latest round began back in October, they also hit the headquarters and the files that had all the backups for the stuff that they had taken. So they've done a lot to set the Iranians back in their ability to reconstitute. Doesn't mean they can't. It just means the timeline for reconstitution is going to be a lot longer.
Yeah, that's so interesting. One of these things leads to another, and in ways that people don't see. Some maybe they did see some of the implications of what they were doing, obviously, but did they see that they would have this kind of opportunity? And anyway, I was worried. Trump, this just 2 months ago, right? 3 months ago, very cool meeting in the Oval Office. Trump surprises Netanyahu. The world's full of, the Trump people will now say this was all a deep Machiavellian plot, which I'm a little dubious about. But in the end of the day, though, he made the decision, and I personally give him credit for it. It wasn't inevitable. I thought he would rather. I think I wrote this Wednesday or Thursday, but I don't know. It was 50-50 in most people's minds whether he would actually go ahead or just leave things alone. It wasn't just, from his point of view, things were okay if left alone. Israel hadn't been able to get to Fordo, but there was still a lot of damage to the Iranian program. We were out of it. What's not to like from his, in a way, and he could then still be a peacemaker. He seems to really. It's a little unclear to me why he made this decision. Honestly, given what we know about him and his views about things, but he did.
I think, first of all, it's been clear, and Secretary Hegseth and J.D. Vance have been accentuating that today. He's always preferred a diplomatic solution to this. I think he believed he had a path to that. Mm-hmm. I think he charged Steve Witkoff with sort of pursuing that. And that was, I think, the background for the meeting with Bibi that, as you pointed out, Bibi only found out about this opening of negotiations shortly before their meeting in the Oval. Clearly was an uncomfortable meeting. The Israelis, I think, have understandable skepticism about Iranian negotiating on this front, because the Iranians have a history of serial prevarication about their nuclear program, and undeclared facilities, and then not coming completely clean. They've never come completely clean about the Ahmad plan, which was this earlier plan for nuclear weapons program that they suspended or halted, as the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007 said, in the wake of our invasion of Iraq, by the way, which doesn't get enough credit for that. But I think what he found was, although Steve Witkoff, by all accounts, we haven't seen what he presented to the Iranians, but from the press accounts, he presented what he called an elegant solution, which seemed to entail some limited ability for Iran for a brief period to continue enriching, then having to stop enriching and having to get their enriched uranium for a nuclear power from an international consortium that would not be physically located in Iran, which would make it difficult for them, therefore, to have all the elements of the fuel cycle on site. And the Iranians basically have, never responded to that, or been unwilling to respond to that, and unwilling to give up, quote, their right to enrich. I think the final straw, from what I can gather, is that he had a phone call with Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, who's quite anxious to end all this. He finds, I think, this very unsettling for a whole host of reasons, demonstration of Israeli military power, which he doesn't care for, because he thinks of Turkey as a regional superpower, fear about Iran collapsing and letting loose a whole wave of Iranian refugees into Turkey. He's just been dealing, hopefully, now reached the point where he can get the 4 million Syrian refugees out of Turkey and back into Syria. So he's got a lot of reasons not to, want this to go on very long. He met with Araghchi in Istanbul, the Iranian foreign minister, on Thursday. And there was this effort to, get a negotiation. And Trump, apparently, according to reporting, was willing to send the vice president, willing to go himself to meet with President Pezeshkian. And the Iranians reportedly could not get a sign-off from the supreme leader because he was in a bunker, fearful for his life because of Israeli strikes and maybe the president's threats. And as a result, I think the president drew the conclusion, look, they're not serious. They're never going to negotiate. We have a window of opportunity. Let's just deal with this now. That's my reading.
Yeah, that sounds right. And it's not the first time that a nation has, that they missed a chance perhaps to get a peace deal that would have been to their advantage. And now they may still have another chance, of course, to cut a deal. I mean, Trump says he wants to have a deal. Otherwise, he's going to attack again or something like that. And maybe Khamenei or his successor would accept stuff that they couldn't accept even a week ago, having seen the damage that has been done. Our friend Elliot Abrams has a piece, I don't know if you've seen it yet, this morning, I think in National Review, where he quotes at great length Khomeiни's famous statement from 1988 that you mentioned to me on the phone actually yesterday, the
poison chalice,
the bitter chalice or poison chalice that he had to, when he stopped the war with Iraq. And it's interesting to read. I never read the actual long statement, and it's perfectly sensible. That wasn't quite the right word because there's a lot of messianic rhetoric in it and so forth. But which is sort of, I didn't want to do this. I wanted to fight as long as we could. It's now become clear that we just can't accomplish anything, and we're hurting ourselves so badly by continuing this war. God knows there's been a huge amount of death and destruction over 8 years. And so I'm drinking the poison chalice and accepting that the war will end. I don't know. It's not inconceivable that we could be back in a situation in 2 months with some kind of negotiations, and people like us worrying that we're not being stringent enough on our inspection regime and all this. But I suppose the main point to say is that the beginning point would be so much, with Iran so much further from, we're pretty certain, I would think, though, from nuclear weapons capability, and then 2 weeks, then if the negotiations, if they'd gone to the negotiating table 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I think that the Supreme Leader has very unpalatable choices right now. he can drink from the poison chalice and hope to just escape and fight another day. There are some people who think that actually, if they reached any kind of agreement, that would be threatening to the regime. That there could be hardliners in the regime who would not accept that this time around. That's a possibility. I think there are a lot of possibilities that that come from that particular branch that the Iranians might take. They might decide, because Iran has been for many years sort of focused on a culture of resistance to American hegemony and to Israel's military power in the region. You can imagine them doing some, trying to take some actions, to strike back. But I'm struck by the fact that, at almost every turn, whether it's hitting, some of the facilities that we have in the region, we have 40,000 troops spread out in a variety of different, bases in Iraq, in Syria, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and the UAE, and Oman, Bahrain. These places right now are locked down and pretty well defended. The Israelis have done a lot to degrade Iran's, military ballistic missile capabilities, particularly launch capabilities. They could launch some volleys at these places, but not be guaranteed of success. Moreover, Qatar and Oman have been very important, go-betweens for the Iranians and the West. I don't think they want to jeopardize those relationships. And they've just invested a lot diplomatically and politically in improving their relationships with the Saudis and the Emiratis, who lobbied the president in favor of diplomacy and against a military strike just a few weeks ago when he was visiting the region. And I'm not sure they want to jeopardize those relationships either. The other option they have, of course, is the proxy network, but that, as we've just discussed, is kind of in shreds. I mean, you still have the Houthis, although the Houthis have been kind of quiet since the Israelis launched an attack against the chief of staff, their military chief of staff, who I don't think has been heard from since. It's not clear whether they killed him or whether maybe they just wounded him. Or whether he's just gone to ground. Any one of those things is possible, I suppose. The popular mobilization forces in Iraq, the Shia militias, who have periodically carried out attacks against U.S. bases, they're having actually over the last week launched about 6 or 7, I think, drones against al-Assad, against one of our bases in Syria, against our consulate in Erbil, all of which were intercepted. There's also the energy of the Gulf, right? They could mine the Gulf and try and close out, the Gulf to shipping. Problem is, then they can't get their own oil out to market. Right. And the Saudis and Emiratis have built pipelines that they can use as alternatives. So almost anything that they do would be kind of have some very big downside risks for them, and they will have to calculate very carefully. And oh, by the way, since they're having so much trouble communicating with the supreme leader, how rapidly any of this happens is another question. Could happen, I suppose, quickly, but maybe not. And then finally, the other thing they have, there's cyber and there's terrorism. And cyber is something that I think we might want to be concerned about, because the DOGE cuts to CISA have and the fact that we have no NSA or Cybercom commander right now because of changes that the administration has made. So we have some vulnerabilities. That's something I think to worry about. On the other hand, unless they take credit for it, it won't be immediately clear that they did it. And if they do take credit for it, they open themselves up to pretty serious both cyber and kinetic retaliation by the United States, which they may not want to undergo. And then finally, they've got terrorism, which, is already the status quo. I mean, Iran before 9/11 had killed more Americans through acts of terrorism than any other country in the world, through its proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon. And they've been waging a terrorist campaign against us since 1979. So, how that would actually differ from the status quo, not clear to me.
Yeah, plus to get back to your original point, I mean, in a way, this brings us full circle. I think it's not like it's not like once we've attacked, I've always been amused by this aspect of these debates. Once we've attacked, it's like their turn to play a card and we don't get to do anything. It's like, of course, we continue to have deterrence. And I think, in fact, and this is your point about Putin, but I think it's very, very true about the Iranians themselves. Khamenei can think about doing these things, but what does he think Trump's going to do next if some Americans get killed on a base somewhere by Iranian proxies? I think, and I actually, even myself, whereas in 2019, was it that some of us criticized Trump for not doing enough when there was Iranians did go after U.S. forces in the region. I kind of think he would, and or at least they would have to think he might. So I think the degree to which this showing of strength may changes the dynamics for everyone's thinking moving forward is really something one has to ponder, and it doesn't solve all the problems, God knows, but it does something they would have to weigh. I do. And look, the other point you make, I'll just close on this maybe and get your reactions. Khamenei's in a tough position. I mean, on the one hand, the people who were skeptics maybe of the nuclear program, who, let's say, are on the more moderate side of the republic, they are thinking, this nuclear program, and the public, of course, itself, which has always been not so friendly to the Islamic regime and its nuclear intentions necessarily. So we spent zillions of dollars and went through international isolation and pretty rough sanctions for decades. For what? I mean, so I think the degree of there've been popular demonstrations, obviously, as recently as 2022, 2023, pretty serious ones. Could those become again? I think so. Could they find more support among elites and from within the regime this time? Maybe, ironically, from those on the right, so to speak, the right wing types, who would say, what are we doing? We can't just be accepting this humiliation. So you could get the degree to which there won't be support for the status quo, that could lead in all kinds of directions. It could lead to a nasty nationalist military junta. It could lead to a hopeful, friendly kind of, let's go back to being pro-Western like before 79. I mean, who knows? But I think the degree of, the Trump people keep saying they don't want regime change. I wish they would just say, and some of them do say this, the point of this was not regime change. The intention is not necessarily regime change. But you don't have to say you wouldn't prefer it if it were changed for the better, So, but anyway, I do think people are underestimating perhaps a little bit how this level of military defeat, it doesn't necessarily change the regime. It doesn't necessarily change policies of the regime, but it's pretty big. It's a pretty big variable to introduce, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I would say just two things on that. I mean, one is, to your point, the estimates I've seen are that the Iranians have spent $500 billion on the nuclear program over 40 years. And given where Iran is economically right now, if you're an average Iranian citizen and you've just seen essentially, $500 billion just go up in smoke, and you're wondering about why your own, economic situation is, so crappy. You see this show up in Iranian protests when they've broken out in 2018 and 19 and 2023. You see signs saying, why are we spending money on Palestine? Why are we, spending money in Syria? It's basically a nice expression of, Iran first. Now, some of that Iran first sentiment, I think right now, because the country's under attack, is more focused on Israel, understandably. I think once the dust settles, there will be recriminations about this, not just the ridiculous spending on a nuclear program that they didn't need, but recriminations about the massive counterintelligence problem that's been exposed, that they are so penetrated by Israeli intelligence. I think that's going to be an issue, intra-elite issue, maybe with some public overtones. And the balance between the population and the regime will have shifted somewhat because the instruments of coercive power that the regime has have been weakened. I mean, the leadership of the IRGC, and the Israelis have now recently hit a few other targets that go more to the internal security side. And the more that happens, until this wraps up, the more that balance shifts. And the regime, the facile comparisons to 2003, I think, are not, well articulated or placed here. Nobody's talking about, invading Iran and imposing, regime change on Iran with U.S. boots on the ground. I think the only issue is, will Iranians rise up as they have historically in the past? I mean, this happened in Iranian history. This is not like, some, fantasy. Happened in 1906. It happened in 1922. It happened in 1979, more recently. And you've seen these expressions of popular antipathy to the regime in the late 90s, and then again several times in the last 5-6 years. So, I'm not predicting that that's going to happen, but it could well happen as the balance shifts. And whether that's for the good or for ill, it's hard to know because there's so many variables. But it's something that we all should be watching out for to see what happens.
And I think it's something that, again, would then test the proposition, if we care about whether it's for good or for ill. Again, not that we're going to invade or put boots on the ground, but are we not going to use diplomatic and economic leverage on for one side or the other? It's sort of, again, I think the notion, I do think Trump has made it very hard to sort of say, well, okay, we did bomb once, but now we're just going to pretend, we're going back to focusing entirely on rounding up, undocumented immigrants or allegedly undocumented immigrants on the streets of LA. And we have no actual things to do in the world. That's become a little harder to sustain, I think. It also raises interesting questions about, which we'll not get to now, but if we could do the, Ukraine and stuff, and sort of the kind of, well, that's not our fight. Ukraine's not our fight. Why is Israel Iran our fight and Russia Ukraine's not our fight? So is that really? Maybe there are reasons. You could say Iran's had more responsibility for the deaths of Americans directly than Putin, I suppose, but though they're pretty good allies. So anyway, many doors to be opened here for questioning and for decisions over the next days, weeks, months, years. And you and Elliot Cohen will be covering all this at Shield of the Republic, and we'll keep on discussing it everywhere else on this website and in our print. I keep saying print publications in our. What is the alternative to video? Anyway, it's print, even though it's not printed, if you know what I mean.
Digital.
Digital publications, yes. So very important, but a very big moment and a very, and I think somewhat encouraging one, I've got to say, don't you think?
Well, so far, but as we said at the outset, once military force starts being used, it's not a direct line. It's not necessarily linear. And so we'll have to see how the Iranians respond, what the next moves are. But I mean, a lot has been accomplished in the last 10 days, and I don't think people should gainsay that. I would want to make one maybe closing comment, which is we've heard a lot of discussion coming from both the right and the left about the president's authorities and Constitution, and I certainly think the administration erred in not notifying the Gang of Eight, which has been the traditional way that you notify presidential use of force. That is to say, the leaders of Congress in both parties and the leaders of the committees of jurisdiction over national security affairs. But having said that, the idea that somehow this is some great constitutional breach, when there was no vote to support either Bill Clinton's operations in Bosnia or Kosovo, which went on for way longer than this. We don't know how long this is going to go on, but I mean, it's those were quite. I mean, Kosovo was like 90 days. That there was no congressional vote to authorize the use of military force in Libya under the Obama administration, and so I mean, the idea that this is some unique, violation of constitutional standards and the congressional right to declare war is, honestly, given the fact that the uncontested power of the purse that clearly is vested in the Congress by the Constitution has been allowed to be usurped by the executive branch with hardly a whimper from the Congress, the idea that that they're going to make a stand on something that is as contested as this is, and as easily shown to be consistent with past presidential practice, I think is foolish.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. Just as a practical matter, I think that's going to fade away. Assuming this is a one-off or close to a one-off, there might be follow-up attacks, but nothing, if we're talking about a pretty precise air campaign. I mean, Bill Clinton bombed the Saddam's plants where in the middle of his impeachment. I remember the Republicans, to their credit, mostly said, okay, we support this for now if it sets back Saddam's nuclear ambitions. They went ahead and impeached him a week later anyway. I mean, it seems like that's a reasonably healthy model of giving the president some discretion, but also not letting it change everything you think about his own administration, right? So, yeah, I mean,
there are justifiable concerns. I saw Charlie Sykes this morning in his newsletter was raising concerns about how the president might use this, and he might, in which case I think all of us have to be vigilant and call out, any misuse or abuse of presidential power, as many of us have been doing for the last 5 months in a variety of other areas. But I also think that, when he does something right, we should also say, look, this was probably the right call. And in this instance, I think it was the right call.
Well said. A good note to end on. And Eric, thank you for joining me today. And this quick analysis, less than 24 hours, but I think a judicious analysis and not a simply, looking for a headline kind of thing, but judicious analysis of what happened, I guess less than 24 hours ago. So thanks for joining me, and look forward to your everything you and Elliot discussed on Shield of the Republic and many further conversations and contributions for you.
Great to be with you, Bill, as always.
And thank you all for joining us on the Bulwark on Sunday.
Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support the Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave.